Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace or do they have more sinister motives? Join your host, Mad Mark, as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that have puzzled mankind for centuries on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark. Today's episode, The Seventh Planet. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I'm Mad Mark, and today we will resume our studies of Zecharia Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, published by Stein and Day in 1976. We are up to Chapter 8, and when we left off with Episode 3, I was talking about the planet Nibiru, how it creates its own atmosphere and can therefore generate its own heat, even though its elongated 3,600-year orbit keeps it far away from the sun for most of that time. Nibiru also has plenty of water, which is another main ingredient needed to support life. The ancient Sumerians were very clear in their description of Nibiru. They often referred to it as the lofty, bright, watery king whose deep is plentiful, bestower of cultivation, or the irrigator of heaven and earth. Scientists have concluded that life originated not on the inner planets of our solar system, where the planets are heavy with chemical components, but rather on the outer planets. And it was from these fringes of our solar system that Nibiru came into our midst, generating its own heat and supplying its own atmosphere. If there is a question at all, it would be, how did life first appear here on planet Earth? Earth was formed some 4.5 billion years ago, and scientists believe that simpler life forms began appearing here within just a few 100 million years. To make a long story short, what all this means is that life, which could not have easily evolved on Earth, actually did not. In the scientific magazine Icarus, an article was published in the September 1973 issue, written by Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick and Dr. Leslie Orgel. It stated that life on Earth may have sprung from tiny organisms from a distant planet. Their theory was that Earth was deliberately seeded by intelligent beings from another planet. And they weren't far from the truth. Actually, the seeding was not a deliberate act from an intelligent species, but it was the result of a celestial collision, as we discussed on the last episode. The collision between Nibiru, its satellites, and Tiamat that broke Tiamat in two, sending half of the planet into its current rotation as Earth, and leaving the other half broken and in pieces, creating the asteroid belt, was the same exact moment when some of the life-giving soil and air of Nibiru was transferred to the new planet Earth. There is no other explanation. If life on Nibiru began even 1% sooner than life on Earth, then it began some 45 million years earlier than it did here. Even by that small margin, it stands to reason that beings as developed as man could have already existed on Nibiru by the time that the first small animals began appearing here on planet Earth. Considering, then, this earlier start for life on the 12th planet, it is possible that its people were capable of space travel a mere 500,000 years ago. We Earthlings have set foot on the moon, but not much more than that. Yes, we have probes in space and land rovers on Mars, but basically our space program is still in its infancy. But Nibiru has actually served as a sort of traveling observatory, taking its inhabitants past the orbits of all the outer planets and enabling them to observe firsthand most of our solar system. It's no wonder, then, that when they first landed on Earth, they brought with them advanced knowledge of astronomy and celestial mathematics. Now, our astronomy and knowledge is geared towards the fact that Earth is the third planet of our solar system. Even on television, they portray us as the third rock from the sun. And indeed we are, if you begin counting from the sun outwards. But if someone were coming into our solar system from the outside inside, the first planet they would pass would be Pluto, the second Neptune, Uranus would be third, and so forth. We here on Earth would be the seventh planet that they would encounter. But the ancient Sumerians considered Earth to be the seventh planet. Now, no one but the Anunnaki, traveling through the solar system from the outside in, would have envisioned it that way. Now, let's assume for the sake of argument that the ancient Sumerians had the knowledge to count Earth's position from Pluto inwards instead of from the sun outwards. Well, then we would also have to assume that they had knowledge of Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. But since they could not possibly have known of the existence of these three outer planets, then we must also conclude that this information was given to them by someone else. No matter which avenue you choose to take here, the conclusion is the same. Only the Anunnaki could have known that there were planets beyond Saturn and that likewise that Earth was the seventh planet. In 1972, NASA launched the Pioneer 10 space probe. It became the first probe to achieve the escape velocity needed in order to leave our solar system. It was also the first probe to travel through the asteroid belt. Its mission was basically to explore Jupiter and its moons, but after that was accomplished, it was then sent out into the far reaches of our solar system and then on out into deep space. Its mission lasted for more than 30 years, and it sent its last signal to Earth in January of 2003. One of the other unique things about this probe was that just in case it was ever discovered by entities from another planet, it included in it a plaque containing a pulsar map on how to get to Earth and a drawing of two human figures. We may never know if many years from now someone will find and understand that message, but the reason I mention it is because you would think that it would be completely ridiculous to expect to find a plaque similar to this here on Earth, only in reverse. A plaque telling the people of Earth how to get here from the planet Nibiru. That would be absurd, right? And yet, such a plaque exists. The evidence I speak of is a clay tablet found in the ruins of the Royal Library of Nineveh. It is basically a route map for Enlil, showing the route to navigate from Nibiru to Earth once Nibiru passes Jupiter. The author, Mr. Sitchin, goes into great detail at this point to decipher the various symbols, directions, and formulas of this tablet, and I highly suggest that you read all that for yourself. For our purposes here, though, we will move on. But only the Anunnaki, traversing the orbits of the planets, could have worked out these formulas, because only they would have had a need for this information. Taking into consideration that both planets were in continuous motion, the Anunnaki had to aim their craft not at the current location of Earth, but at the point where it would be at the time of arrival. The Anunnaki probably worked all of this out in the same way our modern scientists map our space missions. But it's all very fascinating to think about and speculate on. The story of the first Anunnaki settlement on Earth is a breathtaking one, and no less inspiring than the discovery of America. It was certainly of greater importance because if it had not happened, our civilized society would not exist today. You will notice in Mr. Sitchin's text, from here on out, a lot of credit being given to Marduk for many things, mainly because that is how it reads in the Babylonian version of the story. I do not acknowledge that version. I have mentioned it before, and I will mention it again. We will learn all about Marduk at the appointed time in future episodes. There is a vast amount of information that we will study regarding Marduk. But for now, let me just compress everything into a few sentences that will have to hold you over until we get to that point. Marduk was Enki's son. He was not even alive yet when the first Anunnaki landed here on Earth. So giving him credit for making the decision to come to Earth in the first place is completely ridiculous. What happened is this. After the Great Flood, everything in that region of the world was devastated. As the rebuilding process began and new regions were assigned to the various gods, a power struggle amongst them soon ensued. After bitter fighting among the Anunnaki that lasted for thousands of years, Marduk came out on top, if you can call it that. And as they say, to the winners go the spoils. He soon rewrote the history books, making himself the supreme Goomba, etc., etc. It's happened 1,000 times in human history also. So again, that's a completely compressed version of the events that took place. And I didn't even want to mention it yet, but if you're reading the book, as we cover each chapter, you will continually see Marduk's name pop up. There is even a segment where certain tablets refer to the planet Nibiru as Marduk. I don't even have words for that kind of narcissism. It's all completely ridiculous, as you will soon see when we get to that point. But for now, my brief explanation will have to suffice. Okay, on with the story. When the Anunnaki first came to Earth 450,000 years ago, it would have looked quite different than it does now. That is because the Earth was in the middle of an ice age that lasted up until 430,000 years ago. About 1/3 of Earth's landmass was covered in ice sheets and glaciers at that time. So naturally, Earth's weather patterns were all messed up. Areas of the planet that were lush and green then are barren now, and vice versa. Sea levels were also lower by as much as 600 to 700 feet due to all of the captured ice on the land masses. And it was in conditions such as these that the Anunnaki had to find a place to set up their first bases here on Earth. They had to locate an area that met several criteria: a warm climate, access to plenty of water, rivers for irrigation and transportation, and they would need flatland areas suitable for the landings of their crafts, as we now know. The Anunnaki focused their attention on 3 major river systems: the Nile, the Indus and the Tigris, and Euphrates. And each of these areas in time became the centers of ancient civilizations. But their final selection of Mesopotamia as their first home was probably also influenced by its close proximity to seas. Both the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean were nearby. These would be necessary for sea voyages and also for the landings of their crafts, which initially was done by splashing down in the oceans, as we used to do with the Apollo missions. They named their first settlement Eridu, which meant house in faraway built, a rather appropriate name. All of these texts agree that the first Anunnaki to wade ashore and say, "Here we settle," was Enki. And Eridu remained Enki's seat of power and center of worship throughout Mesopotamian history. So Enki supervised the construction of Eridu and the surrounding areas, and as soon as things were up and running, Enlil descended to Earth to take charge and oversee the mission. Soon after that, more manpower, tools, and equipment were sent down. But these massive shipments required much heavier loads. Splashdowns at sea were no longer adequate. So it was time to shift the landing site into the center of Mesopotamia. The site that Enlil selected, known for millennia as Nippur, or Earth's Crossing, would become the site for this new sophisticated command post. It would become a place where the Anunnaki could coordinate space flights to and from Nibiru, guide in landing shuttlecrafts, or perfect their takeoffs and dockings with a mothership orbiting Earth. The sister of both Enki and Enlil, Ninhursag, was also brought down to establish the new medical center in Shuruppak. This fact is not crucial to the story at this point, but it will be extremely important in future episodes, so I just wanted to get that groundwork established here. Following the completion of Nippur, construction began on the spaceport of the Anunnaki here on Earth. The ancient texts make it clear that Nippur was the place of the words, where the commands were uttered, but the actions themselves took place at the Cape Canaveral of the Anunnaki in Sipar, the city in charge of the Chief of the Eagles, where multi-stage rockets were raised within its special enclave, the Sacred Precinct. These first cities on Earth were laid out with a particular plan in mind. These alien beings who were capable of space travel had a goal based on a vital need: to be able to land on Earth and take off again from Earth. The Anunnaki were strangers to Earth, and as they scanned the planet from space, they undoubtedly paid close attention to the mountain ranges. These could be hazardous for landings and launches, but they could also serve as very useful landmarks, and some of these natural landmarks stood out among the others there in Mesopotamia, where they chose to make their home Mount Ararat. An extinct volcano, Mount Ararat dominates the plateau where currently Turkey, Iran, and Armenia meet. It stands 3,000 feet above sea level on its eastern and northern sides, and up to 5,000 feet on its northwestern side. And this entire towering dome is roughly 25 miles in diameter. The other desirable property of it is the two peaks, Little Ararat at 12,900 feet and Great Ararat at 17,000 feet tall. And these peaks are permanently snow-covered, which makes them stand out like two shining beacons. There is reason to believe that the Anunnaki selected this site by coordinating a north-south meridian with an unmistakable landmark and a convenient river location. A line drawn through the center of the twin-peaked Ararat bisected the Euphrates River. That was the target. But was it easy to both land and take off from there? Absolutely. The area was a perfect plain, and the surrounding mountain ranges were a substantial distance away. Another advantage of this region was the fact that the area was rich in surface bitumens, petroleum products that seeped up through natural wells and could be collected from the surface without any deep drilling or digging. Of course, they no longer use these crude fuels for their craft as we still do, but back then they probably did. And Mesopotamia was a plentiful source of them. The Anunnaki did not lay out their early settlements haphazardly. They had to study the area's resources and hazards. And then, when the area was chosen, all of the settlements were laid out in a specific pattern with the purpose of outlining the landing path to Sipar. Mr. Sitchin goes into great detail about all of this in his book, so once again, please read it if you want more information in this area. For our purposes of this podcast, I now move forward to Chapter 11. You know, if it seems like we're skipping around a lot here on this show, you're absolutely right, we are. But we're following the outline of Zecharia Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, and that's how the book is laid out. It's more of an overview of all of the information that he had gathered on the Anunnaki at the time that that book was written. Each successive book concentrates more on specific areas regarding the Anunnaki, and so will we in this show when we reach that point. Chapter 11 is entitled Mutiny of the Anunnaki, but it could just as easily have been The War in Heaven, in reference to the biblical passages in Revelations. Although it wasn't really much of a war, the biblical story is greatly over-exaggerated, and it most certainly was not a battle between good and evil. Mr. Sitchin was correct in referring to it as a mutiny. That's much closer to the truth. Now, don't get me wrong, there were many wars in ancient times concerning these Anunnaki gods. They really did not get along with each other very well. And that truth is something that we will cover in depth on future episodes. As time went on, power struggles developed, egos clashed, and, well, you would think we were talking about human behaviors here. But as we will learn, these gods were very much like us, and we are very much like them. So now on to this story of the mutiny of the gods. Since we're already about 3/4 of the way through this episode, I will begin this account now, and then the majority of it will carry over into the next show. All right, now we've already discussed how Anu was the king of Nibiru, and he only came to Earth for state visits or if there was a huge problem that he needed to deal with. But for the most part, he left all the dealings on Earth up to his two sons, Enlil and Enki, who were half-brothers. Enlil was next in line for the throne of Nibiru, which was an area that was a real sore spot for Enki. But Enlil was a great leader and commander. He was very businesslike and abrupt, basically not a very compassionate person, and he definitely did not think outside the box. He was just very straightforward, a real, let's do things how we've always done them and just get the job done type of guy. Whereas Enki was the scientist, creator, metallurgist. He basically set up everything here on Earth from the beginning. He was described as a very loving and caring person who had great wisdom. So, as I said on an earlier show, Enki came to Earth first and basically got everything established. He made sure that everything was up and running and functioning according to the plan. When all that work had been accomplished, Enlil came down to take over command. So a separation of powers was agreed upon. According to the texts, Enlil was given the land, Enki was given the oceans. Enlil was in charge of the upper world, and Enki was given rule of the lower world. Now, as you can imagine, this of course has caused great confusion through the years for translators and scholars. And by the way, here's a perfect example of the importance of translating things correctly. As time passed, scholars and translators misinterpreted the term lower world to underworld, and then eventually to Hades, and then hell, effectively turning Enki into the devil or Satan, which couldn't be further from the truth. The terms upper world and lower world basically were referring to the northern and southern hemispheres. And this makes perfect sense, because after all, the Anunnaki's purpose for coming to Earth was to mine gold. And those first mines were in South Africa. So Enlil ran the operations of the spaceport, where his talents as a commander were needed, and Enki took charge of the mines because, as a scientist and geologist, he knew much more about that end of the spectrum. Now, again, I am greatly simplifying all of this. There is and was a lot more to it than that, but I'm trying to keep this simple so that everyone can understand it. So, in summation, Anu put each of his sons in charge of the areas where their individual talents could be the best utilized. Makes perfect sense to me. So to make a long story short, Enki goes to South Africa to set up and begin mining operations. Now, there are many references to gold and other metals in ancient texts, suggesting a familiarity with metallurgy from the earliest of times. A very vigorous metal trade existed even at the beginning of civilization. The texts indicate that it was one of many types of knowledge granted to the people by the gods who had engaged in metallurgy and mining before humans were even on the planet. Adrian Boschier and Peter Beaumont wrote an article in Optima magazine in 1972 telling of their discoveries while excavating ancient mining sites in South Africa. The pair stated that they had come across layer upon layer of prehistoric mining activities as well as human remains. Carbon dating at Yale University revealed that the age of the artifacts ranging anywhere from 2000 BC to 7690 BC. A second excavation at a cliff face on the western slopes of Lion Peak uncovered artifacts dating from 20,000 BC to 26,000 BC. Mining during the Stone Age? Not by humans. The scholars then dug a shaft down to where these original miners had begun their operations. A charcoal sample from that dig was dated at 41,250 BC. But what were they mining? Well, I'm sure that they mined for many things. I mean, as long as you're already there, why not? But the main thing that they were after was gold. They needed it desperately to save their planet. But that's a story for later. Evidence suggests that man's own infatuation with gold actually stems from the Anunnaki's great need for it. Monkey see, monkey do. It's important to our gods, so therefore it's important to us. But even though Enki was responsible for not only getting all the Anunnaki operations started on Earth, including the mining, he didn't do all the mining by himself. In fact, the majority of the work, day in and day out, fell to the rank and file Anunnaki, the gods who performed the tasks, the common folk. Isn't that always the way? The texts tell us that eventually there were 600 Anunnaki on Earth. 7 of those were the leaders or commanders, such as Enki and Enlil, but the rest were the rank and file workers, and they basically did all of the work. The texts go on to say that the 7 great Anunnaki were making the lesser gods suffer the toil, and out of all of their duties, digging in the mines was the thing they hated the most. And they did this hard labor for a long time. We are told that their work went on for over 11 shars. That's 400,000 years. So even if you're an Anunnaki, for whom 1 shar, or 3,600 years, feels like only a year to you, that's still 11 years of hard labor. And according to the texts, they were getting damn tired of carrying that heavy burden. It's just like today, where companies are cutting back their workforce to the bare minimum and piling all the workload onto just a few people. It gets old real fast. So, what ended up happening then is the exact same thing that happens now. The workers revolted.
Screw guys and gang home!
The texts tell us that Enlil, the supreme commander of the Anunnaki operations on Earth, was planning a trip from his base in Sumeria down to South Africa to check in with Enki and see how things were going with the mining operations. And the workers seized that opportunity to put their mutiny into action. The texts tell us that the workers proclaimed, "Let us confront our chief officer, that he may relieve us of our work. The king of the gods, the hero Enlil, let us unnerve him in his dwelling." The leader of the mutiny, whose name is unfortunately broken off, further excited the workers. "Now proclaim war. Let us proclaim hostilities and battle." Well, you can almost imagine the panic going through the mind of Enlil, and Enki too, for that matter. If there were 600 Anunnaki on the Earth at that time, you subtract the 7 commanders, that's 593 workers. And at least 300 to 400 of them had to be working the mines, since that was the top priority of the Anunnaki mission on Earth. So that's 300 to 400 against 2. Not very good odds. And that is where we will stop for this week. Nothing like a good cliffhanger. So what have we learned this week? Well, we learned about the planet Nibiru and how it is able to sustain life, even though the majority of its orbit takes it far away from the sun. We studied how the collision between Nibiru, its moon, and Tiamat actually seeded life here on Earth. We learned that Earth is actually the 7th planet if you're entering our solar system from the outside in. We studied what things were like when the Anunnaki first arrived on planet Earth, that our planet was still in an ice age, and Sumeria was meticulously chosen as the place to set up their base of operations. And we learned about the Anunnaki gold mining operations in South Africa, and how the tiring and relentless labor of the worker class Anunnaki led to a great uprising or mutiny, otherwise known in the Bible as the War on Heaven and Earth. And we left off with a great cliffhanger that I know will have you all back here for the next exciting episode, where we will all find out exactly what happened. And that is where I leave you for this week. You have quite a lot to digest there, and we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this episode. So please tell your friends and help spread the word about us. I also wish to remind everyone that listening to this podcast is no excuse to not read the book that we're discussing here, The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. It is an amazing work, and I'm leaving out much information in order to keep this podcast flowing properly. So do yourselves a favor and read that book. Today we've taken another step in our ongoing journey to find the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. This has been Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to more of the mysteries that puzzle mankind.